The goal of this video is to show you how to set up a Windows share from FreeNAS that gives you permissions that inherit naturally. And we're going to go some typical scenarios that you would usually encounter managing shares permissions on a Windows share. We want to get it set up so that we can set up subdirectories within a share and have each directory dedicated to specific user, set of users, or a group that users are members of, and have the permissions inherited automatically on files that are created. One of the problems I dealt with in trying to set this up was the everyone group had read access to everything, which is bad because if you have files that contain sensitive data, you only want certain groups of users to have access to it. You don't want to have to constantly manage that and explicitly removing permissions from that. There's ways you can deal with this using group ownership within FreeBSD, but I find that to be a little bit more difficult than just using the paradigm of setting permissions explicitly on a directory and then having the confidence that anything created within that subdirectory will share those same permissions. So let's start by creating a ZFS volume. We're running under FreeNAS 9.1, and we're going to go to storage, create a volume. I'm just going to use a single disk, but this will work with any type of ZFS volume. I don't know what behavior you'll get with a UFS volume, but for ZFS, we're going to call this example for the sake of this video and add volume. And I'm going to pause for. Okay, we got our example volume set up here, and we're going to go ahead and add our admin user. Now the way this works with a home work group is this username needs to match the Windows username. I have a user called Bob the admin I have set up in a Windows account, and the password also needs to match their Windows password. So if you don't have a password, I believe under Control Panel you can find the users and go to your user account, and there should be a create password option. In this create a new primary group for the user, just leave that checked by default. It's a little weird because you'll see that you also have full name is also required, so I'm just going to call it Bob. Important thing before I leave the screen, username and password needs to match exactly what you have in Windows. And click OK. And you'll see it adds also a group name, the same thing. Just ignore that. That's just kind of a FreeBSD kind of thing, convention. Doesn't really concern us. From a Windows standpoint, it's weird to create a group for each user. Usually you only create groups that are actually groups of users, but just kind of ignore that. Now we are going to change the permissions of the example pool here. So we have it selected here, change permissions. And the first thing we need to do is change the owner. Now you could do this using group ownership and setting it to right and just adding certain users to the wheel group, or creating a group just for administrators. But the way I've done this and successfully tested is changing the owner. I'm not sure if setting the right bit to group will give you all the necessary permissions, because when we switch to the Windows, you're going to see this becomes disabled. So I'm not sure if that will take effect or not. That's the reason we're changing the owner first as well. And then I'm going to go back and switch it to Windows ACLs. Once you switch to Windows ACLs, you won't be able to change the owner, even though it doesn't disable that field. Any changes you may try to attempt to make to this field will not take effect. I don't know why that is, but that's just the way it is. Oops, I did not mean to check that. All right, let me go back and make sure that that checkbox didn't take effect. Alright, so we've got our owner and Windows ACLs. ACL, by the way, is access controlling, which I think is just a fancy word for permissions. Now we are going to share this. So this volume is not shared. So this is Windows shares, add Windows share. I'm going to name it the same thing as my volume. I don't know if that's a good convention or not, but that's what I'm doing. And then you need to change the path to your share that you found here, or your volume. So I'm sharing the example volume. And then don't believe there's anything else we want to change here. We don't need to set these. By default, the behavior of the ZFS pool is going to be pass through, which is the inherit behavior that we want. Alright. Last thing we're going to do now, it didn't prompt me. Usually it prompts me when you create the first share to turn on the services, but the service can be found under Services, Control Services. Oh, mine is actually already on. So sometimes it prompts you to turn it on, but it doesn't actually turn it on. So either way, you want to come here to Control Services and change the settings here for CIFS. CIFS is what's used for the Windows share and FreeNAS. And your work group needs to match your work group of your computer. So this is my client computer, and you can see its work group is set up to some work group is the actual name of it. So we're going to change, just need to add the word some here. And this is going to be, take note of this name here because that's how you're going to access the share. I'm going to leave it at the default, the same as the host name of the system. Alright, scroll down here and click OK. Now, actually, while we're here, one other change I forgot to make. So we need to make sure that the everyone group doesn't have read and write permissions to anything. So you can see by default the default file mask is 0666. Now this is not an actual mask. In FreeBSD, when you set a mask, it's usually a maximum permissions, and it's inverted usually because it's a bitwise mask, if you're familiar with that. In this case, it's really a default. And for those not familiar with this, what this means is read and write for the user, read and write for the group, and read and write for everyone else. So if I don't give a specific user or group permission to this to a directory, by default all files that are created there, I don't want everyone to be able to access it. I only want those specific to that user or group. So I'm going to set that to 0, and that'll say no read or write for the everyone group. In FreeBSD, that's known as other. Same for directory, and you see they do 777 by default. The reason it's a 7 instead of a 6 because directories get the ability to be traversed as well as read and write. So read and write is 2 and 4, 2 plus 4 is 6, and then there's a bit of 1 for traverse, so 1 plus 2 plus 4 is 7. It's a little bit confusing. I don't want to get into the details of that if you're not familiar with that. There's plenty of tutorials on Unix, Linux permissions out there if you want to deal into that. But just know, if you are from a background, Unix background, Linux background, this is not really a mask. This is a default. So you're not setting an inversion of what you want. You're setting actually what you want. So this means that files, new files that are created are gonna get this permission. Now we've set that. We need to save that. So the important thing there, again, sorry, kind of went on a long tangent there, but that's disabling read and write for the everyone group, so that as new files are created, they aren't by default accessible to everyone, because that'd be a huge security problem. After we make that change, you do need to cycle the Windows share service here, and so I'm going to turn it off and turn it back on. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add our other user. This is going to represent just a non-administrator user that we want to give access. This is not important. Again, this username and the password, so I'm going to ask Jim to type in his password for me. Needs to match. If you're using Active Directory, a Windows domain, you can sync your users with FreeNAS so that you don't have to necessarily know what their passwords are. That's kind of a whole different set of documentation that I'm not going to get into. Alrighty, so we have an admin and a user, and I believe that's all we need to do here. So we're going to switch over here to, I'm logged in right now as Bob the admin. Just access any old window, either a folder or whatever, and it's / the host name. You remember under services there was the NetBIOS name. And I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to list all the shares we've created. If we had other shares, for example, if I had added another share for one of my other pools, such as Tank, it would show up here also, but I only have one right now. And these shares can, just like any other share, you can do a map network drive, all that good stuff. Alright, so we've got an empty share here. Let's set up a users folder now, and what we can do, I'm going to demonstrate a couple of things. So users, I'm just going to leave that default. Users with traversal, users with traversal and list, and read only, none, read modify. Alright, I think that covers all the bases of what I want to demonstrate. Let's go ahead and modify some permissions. And you notice by default the owner is here, the default group. This all comes from this permissions area right here. So the owner and the group. So owners are different from ACLs or permissions, and you're going to always get these owners. That's why I didn't choose to, for example, you might be tempted to say, okay, I'm going to put all my users into some group called users of my domain, or whatever you want to call the group, and then switch this group over to them. If you do that, then everyone's going to have access to everything, because by default this group is going to be the owner of all files that are created. The ability to remove permissions and then on a folder and have everything created within it, not have that group, it'll ignore that. The groups, it's really difficult to, unless I could go to that mask and take off that mask, but really the way I think about it when setting this up is that this is like my super administrator group. Anyone in this group is going to be able to access everything and do anything. The owner is going to be able to do anything to it. As an aside though, if you wanted it to work that way, like I mentioned, you probably need to set up the group to have ability to change permissions. But basically what I'm getting at is don't start putting your users into the group that you have here. Consider this like a super user group. It's better to leave them out, because what we're going to do is, rather than, if we add people to a group, we're going to use the permissions, the ACLs, to give them access rather than this screen here. Simply because the owner group ends up on everything. There's no way to stop it. There's no easy, natural way to stop it from showing up. By natural, I mean using inheritance. There's ways in FreeBSD to set mask and things like that, but it becomes a little bit problematic to manage the way with the approach that I want to take. Alrighty, so back to what we were doing here. So you can see now everyone is listed here, but what I want to show you is that they have limited permissions. So they can't traverse folders and they can't read data. They can read attributes and extended attributes, but they won't actually be able to open any files. They won't even be able to go into a folder and see the contents of the folder. As far as they would get is right here. They would see what's in the root of the share, and then as soon as they try to go here, they would get an error and be unable to traverse into that folder if they didn't have permissions to that folder. Alrighty, so we're going to go ahead and add the user. Which one are we on? So let's do users with traversal. We're going to add Jim the user. Now in Windows, you can type a partial name and then click check names and it'll find it. In FreeNAS, you don't have to put the domain on it, the host name, but you do have to type the whole username. I can't just type Jim and it find it. It'll hang up for a long time. Alrighty. So what I want to do is give him some very specific permissions just for demonstration purposes. Alright, I'm only going to give him traverse folder. I'll leave these read attributes. Those are meaningless right here. And read permissions. He can see what permissions are on it, and you'll see that those are not significant. Okay. On this one, I'm going to give him both traversal and list. Actually, the way I did that, just for consistency, make sure he gets those defaults. I'm going to do the next one a little bit different so that doesn't happen. Alrighty. Let's add him through here first, so he gets the defaults. Working with this thing being backed by FreeBSD, the way it maps Windows permissions to the ACLs is a little bit funky. For example, the everyone group, you'll notice nothing is checked here. It says special because that set of read attributes and read permissions, it doesn't fit into any of these little presets. These things you see here aren't really Windows permissions. This is really sort of a group of permissions, because you can see Jim has this read list. I'm going to get rid of all of those from the advanced interface. So you can see if we go to advanced and look at Jim, it corresponds to more than just 3. He has these read attributes, read extended change permissions. Alright, anyhow, so we're going to do traverse and list here, which just so happens to be the same thing I gave him here, but I just wanted to demonstrate the difference between traversal and list. This is going to be your typical users folder where we create a folder for each user. So I could create a folder here for Jim and give him read and write, but I'm going to show you a little bit something different in a little bit. Read only. Let's go ahead and add Jim as a read only. Jim, the user. read list. All that's good. I'm just going to leave it like that. Read and modify. Give him the modify preset. And then you'll see none has this everyone listed, but Jim's not listed. But this everyone permission doesn't really give them anything. They don't have the ability to list or read contents, and we'll demonstrate that in just a moment. So let's go ahead and switch over to Jim. And even though we didn't change any permissions on the root of the share, you can see I can browse into the share and see all the contents of the root of the share, even though we never actually went to this folder and we didn't change any properties here. By default, when you create that volume, everyone has access to the root of that, the other group in FreeBSD, which is good. And you can see I can't access none. I can access read and modify. I can create files, testing. I can edit those files and save them. I can create folders. Whoops. And all of these will have the same permissions. There's a read-only folder. Oops, what I didn't do, I should have created a file under the other user just to demonstrate here. Read-only. And just to demonstrate that it's inheriting those permissions all the way down. You should have put some stuff in here. Alright, let's switch back over to the user. Alright, we're in read-only, so I can read the file. If I try to edit it and save it, it asks me for a different location because I don't have permission to save this. Try to replace it, it says access denied. So I can't edit it. I can go in here. Can I edit this one maybe? Nope, can't edit that one either. Alright, so that read-only permission is trickling down. I'm able to read all the subfolders automatically. We only explicitly set permission here, but all the folders that were created by the other user automatically inherited those permissions. So now we're going to do a read modify. We should be able to edit this guy. Save. Works perfectly fine. Did we put a file there? Let me look. I don't think I did. Oh. We have a problem here. Owners shares are not getting inherited. Alright, we will address that. So this folder that was created by the user is inaccessible to me as the admin, because the admin did not have permission to the file. He did not have an ACL. He was the owner of this folder, and so it's not a problem with the inheritance of the permission, it's a problem with the inheritance of the owner. Even though it appears to be just another permission here, just like Jim, this is considered ownership within the realm of FreeBSD, and so it does not get inherited. So I will address that in a little bit, but let's continue with our testing here. Did we put any content? Yeah, I put some contents in here. I haven't put anything in there yet, but that's the same thing as list and traverse. So let's switch back over to the user and continue with the demonstration. So you can see traversal is not enough to view the contents. You have to have the ability, the list permission to actually see what's in there. Now let me show you what happens though with traversal. It's a little bit of an odd thing. Let's just call it Jim. And it inherited the Jim's ability to traverse, but this folder we're going to give him, let's actually do it this way. Let me just edit Jim, allow, modify, read, execute. So we're going to give Jim read and write access to this folder. So he has the ability to traverse the folder. Oops. So we can see all he really has is traverse. He doesn't have list or read data. He can't modify anything. But this subfolder, I gave him read and write. So let's see what that means. Alrighty, so I can't access it still, but if I type it here, if I were to map this network drive or set up a shortcut or what have you directly to that Gem subfolder, I can get there. You usually would not be able to do that. You have to have traversal permissions for all the folders leading up. So because I have the traversal permission here, I'm able to get into that folder without the list permission. So I can't actually see the contents of that folder, but I can get into it. So that's a pretty narrow edge case. Most of the cases you just do traversal and list. For example, your users folder, and then for each folder you'd have specific permissions for each user. Alrighty, so we've demonstrated that we can set up permissions for each subfolder and then create files within it, and those subfiles will inherit the permissions, but they won't inherit the owner. So let's go ahead and try to fix that. I'm hoping I can fix that without having to do a new video. So let's set this to inherit owner. And I don't think I need to restart the service for this, but just because I have problems sometimes I really hate testing it and it doesn't work, and I wonder, does it not work because that's not the setting I need to change, or does it not work because I need to restart something? So let's go back in here and whoops. Oh, I restarted the service, so it lost connection. That's a little bit funky. It is on. Let me just log off. Alrighty. And it was this read modify, this blah. I created this and Bob was not there. So let's go ahead and create another one. Test 2. And Bob shows up now. Alright, so we fixed that issue. And just to confirm that, let's create a file in here. And let's switch over to Bob and make sure he can access that. Because we want to make sure that administrator always has access to everything. And this is just the issue because I restarted the service. It's sitting there trying really hard. I might have to log off and log back on. Oh, nope, there we go. All right, so read modify test 2. All right, we can access it now. We can edit it because we are the owner. We are the administrator, right? And let's, if for some reason Jim was a bad person and we needed to take him off, okay. So we have all the rights we need to do that stuff. And the last thing I want to show you is just a little bit of troubleshooting. If you need to see, you can come in here and navigate, go up a directory so we get into the root, and we're going to go into mount. This is where you find your pools that you've created. So you can see there's our example. Go, whoops, I spelled it wrong. They are case sensitive. If I hadn't typed that as a capital E, it wouldn't have found it because I created the pool with a capital E. That's really why in FreeBSD and Linux you see a lot of things are all lowercase just to avoid that confusion. But I'm from like a C# programmer background where things are camel case, so it's just what I'm used to. Don't hate me for that. And what I want to show you is the ZFS get command. You can do ZFS get all and the name of your pool. Shows you these are ZFS properties that are set on the pool, so you can see things like the ACL inherit is pass through, which means it's going to pass the ACLs on down the line, I believe. Either that, or it means it's going to, this property is set from, properties can be inherited. So it's a little bit confusing when you're dealing with a property that's telling you whether or not permissions will be inherited, but the setting of that property can be inherited from another pool. The reason being, or not pool so much, you can have data sets nested inside pools and ZFS volumes nested inside ZFS pools, and all of these properties can be inherited. You know, this one's set locally, this one's the default value, things like that. So it gets a little bit confusing. I still don't have my head completely wrapped around this property, but it should be set to pass through. You can set it, or you can view that individual one. You can look at ACL inherit and see its setting is pass through. If if you need to change it, I believe it's like this. It's through. Yep. So it's the if you try to pass it something that doesn't make sense, it'll actually give you this little prompt. It'll say valid values or discard, no allow, restricted, pass through, or pass through X. Now what restricted does, from what I understand from the manual, is if you can give someone a permission on a folder that actually gives them permissions to modify the permissions of the folder. So I could give, if I accidentally gave Jim that permission to actually modify the permissions of the folder, then what would happen? Well, Jim could then give other people permissions to the folder, and Jim may not be following best practices as far as the security of his data when it comes to setting permissions. If I remember how to do that, that's basically one way to do it, is to edit this and give I could give him full control, which includes that, or I could go to advanced, change permissions, edit, change permissions. You can see this bit right here. You can do that, take ownership. So that can be a security risk, is if you accidentally give someone a permission to change permissions. So what restrict does is, at least as new files are created within that, they won't inherit the ability to change permissions. So even though Jim might be able to change permissions on this one file you accidentally gave full control to, or this one folder, and give other people permissions to that folder, he won't be able to change permissions on subfolders and subfiles, because restrict says, while we let permissions be inherited, we do not let the ability to change permissions be inherited, which is in FreeBSD speak, modifying ACLs. So it doesn't give you any feedback when it succeeds, but you can of course go back and look at it using the ZFS Git. And there it is, pass through. Alright, that's that for that. I know I got off on a lot of tangents there and seemed to be all over the place, but it was kind of a long trip getting to where I got all the different behaviors that I was hoping for. I wanted to test all those scenarios and demonstrate to you how to set up folders for those very specific scenarios and demonstrate some of the nuances of that. Just want to note that if you get into doing things like trying to, if you go in here to advanced, you may be, turn off the include inheritable permissions, or do the replace all child objects with permissions. Some of those more advanced things don't really work right. You'll get errors as it's trying to do it. So just, before you start doing those things, set up a folder with some subfiles and stuff and test it there before you do it in production, because some of those things don't map so well to the FreeBSD ACLs. There's not a good mapping there, so you just have to be cautious of that. Alrighty, hope that this was useful. I've seen lots of posts that talk about trying to set up inherited permissions and solutions proposed that deal with doing lots of command line stuff with Unix mask and just things that I didn't want to deal with. So I wanted to find a solution that was more natural to me. Hopefully no really expert FreeBSD people flame me for that. That's just my paradigm of how I'm used to dealing with things, what I've found works well, and what I've seen used at lots of shops that works well. I did a lot of stuff setting specific user, but the same thing would work with groups. Just create your group, or if you've got your Active Directory set up in FreeNAS, you should be getting that stuff synced over, so you should be able to set up groups and have those inherited down using the same technique. The purpose really was to just show you that, that it does inherit permissions if you get it set up just right. Alrighty, good luck with that.